President Trump is just horrible on immigration. President Biden is not nearly as bad as President Trump is on immigration, but President Biden is not good on immigration. Both parties have prioritized fiscal responsibility too low on their list of priorities. But, wasn't that long ago that President Clinton balanced the budget. President Bush kind of blew that up. President Obama took some steps to reduce the deficit, but didn't really go as far as he should have.
Hello, welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper show. I hope you're having a prosperous day. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn, and today I'm delighted to have on another guest who is always talking about free markets and making sure that we have fiscal solvency and letting us know that the American dream is not dead, and it's none other than Michael Strain. Michael, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope that you are having a prosperous day.
Well, I am. I certainly am. Every day. I try to. I'm blessed. That's for sure. So let me, for the audience, go ahead and read your bio, and then we'll jump right into it. Michael Strain is the Director of Economic Policy Studies and the Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute, also known as AEI. His research and writing span a wide range of areas, including labor markets, public finance, social policy, and macroeconomics. He has published several dozen articles in leading academic and policy journals. Dr. Strain is also author of The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It, which we're going to talk about some today, in which he examines long-term trends and economic outcomes for typical workers and households. He received his PhD in economics at Cornell University. So with all of that, Michael, why do you do what you do every day?
To answer that question honestly, a big part of the reason I don't have many other marketable skills, and I have to put food on the table and pay the mortgage. I went into this line of work. I was attracted to economics because I really thought it could answer some of the most important questions facing society in a better way than alternative academic disciplines. Economics I've always thought of kind of at its best answering empirical positive questions to be an input into normative debates. So when I was in school, I tried to develop the skills required to answer normative questions, but I needed much more help being able to answer empirical questions than being able to answer normative questions. And so economics was a route to being able to really kind of understand what's happening out there in the world, and then to understand how to make it better. Why do I practice economics in the way that I do? It really is to kind of push the country in a better direction. The word I would use is not prosperity is important. Ultimately, I think prosperity is a path to broader notions of human flourishing and of social flourishing. That's a big part of what gets me out of bed in the morning is being able to play a teeny tiny small role in the conversation that is happening in Washington. And I think Aristotle kind of conceived of politics as answering the question, how ought we to order our life together? And ought is of course a normative word, but that's kind of what we're doing, is we're trying to figure out what's the best way to order our life together. And I have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. Just a few. And I want to hear them. I do want to hear them, Michael. One of the things that you talked about there was a lot of good information. It's kind of where I'm at too on economics as a tool, with looking at the world and how it works. It always made sense to me when I first started studying it, and helping us hopefully to understand more so we won't repeat the same mistakes again that we have in the past and come up with something new. One of the things you brought up though was about prosperity. And my whole mantra that I've been doing, and the title of this show is Let People Prosper. And like I've talked about before, I don't mean it from a material prosperity. That's part of it, but I also mean it from a spiritual
part of it.
Yeah, it's an important part of it. We can't do a lot if we don't have those material things, but it's also spiritual, right? Like you have the opportunity to do those things. It's freedom of speech. I mean, there's so much that's involved with prospering or flourishing, which I love that word as well. And so I think that it's important to distinguish those things, because some people say, oh, well, you're just a prosperity gospel talking about that. And, it's not that. It's that we can have so much more if we are given freedom and liberty. And I'm a classical liberal, Michael. And so from that perspective and that background, it kind of jumps into economics. Just makes sense. Let people flourish.
No, I agree with you on the importance of broadening the lens and and looking at prosperity or flourishing, to include material well-being, but also to include the ability to express yourself, the ability to say what's on your mind, the ability to practice your faith, and to reach, to have spiritual fulfillment. But I do think it's important not to downplay the importance of material well-being. In a lot of the fights that we're having in the public square these days, between people who kind of push back against this growing bipartisan consensus that we need more central planning, more involvement from Washington in economic affairs, folks on our side are often accused of caring too much about GDP or caring too much about material well-being. And I think we've conceded that point a little too we've gone a little too far in conceding that point. Material well-being is really valuable. Scientists just cracked the code on the first drug to really make some progress against Alzheimer's. That's an amazing thing. That's material consumption. That's kind of material well-being. That happens because pharmaceutical companies can pursue profits. And that's life-changing. If you look at the United States when the food stamp program was enacted, which wasn't that long ago. 6 decades or so, child poverty was rampant. Children didn't have enough food. Children were starving in large numbers. That's bad. So, it's easy to, the kind of Bernie Sanders critique, how many different kinds of deodorant do you need? You're starting to hear, you walk into a grocery store, there, I think Sanders said 23. You walk into a grocery store, there are 23 kinds of deodorant. How many do you need? You're hearing very similar criticisms from the kind of populist and nationalist political right these days. And I don't know. I mean, I think for individuals and for a society that has never really had to deal with material deprivation, downplaying the importance of material well-being is pretty easy. The ability of markets to generate consumption goods is really remarkable. And
it really is. And it's a new phenomenon. I mean, I like the hockey stick that kind of shows GDP per capita over time. And this is very recent. I mean, 18th, late 18th century, really in the 19th century is when really you start to see it pick up dramatically as there were expansion of markets, more capitalism that was happening. A lot of these things, the profit and loss system, better allocating resources and allowed us to be more prosperous in the process. And now we have increasing life expectancies. There's just so much more that we could have because of that material well-being that's there. You're exactly right. You're right on there. And what's interesting about all this, Michael, kind of going to your point about the left and some on the right seem to be joining forces to some extent, is that we hear this idea about the American dream is dead. And you have this book, The American Dream is Not Dead, although populism might kill it or something, right on those lines. But I wonder, what is your point? Like when you go and start talking to these folks, and that book came out in 2020. So there was something else that happened in 2020 with the pandemic and lockdowns and all this other stuff that's going on. But those issues are still there. If anything, they're more alive and well than ever. And so I wonder what you've heard and if your thoughts have changed any, or maybe they've gotten even more along those lines. But what do you say about the American dream is dead?
Yeah, I was just struck and kind of continue to be struck by this bipartisan consensus that everything is terrible. You hear these assertions about how the gains from economic growth only accrue to the top. You hear these assertions that wages and incomes for typical workers and households have been stagnant for decades. You hear these assertions that America is no longer an upwardly mobile society. You see all this concern about the hollowing out of the labor market, the middle of the labor market. This idea that capitalism is this system that just kind of destroys jobs and destroys opportunities. You hear it from the political left. You hear from the political right. Just read President Trump's first inaugural address, talking about rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the United States, referring to American carnage. You hear very similar rhetoric from Bernie Sanders, very similar rhetoric from Josh Hawley, Republican, very similar rhetoric from Elizabeth Warren, a Democrat. And you don't just hear it from political leaders. I mean, you hear it from economists, you hear it from opinion leaders. You hear it from, cable TV show hosts. You hear it from the business community. I think that it's just not true. In a very, the claims are so overstated that they're just wrong. If you look at the 1970s and 80s, sure, we had stagnant or declining wages for typical workers on average. A lot of that because of the high inflation of the 1970s that ate away nominal wage gains. But if you look at the last 35 years, since we really got inflation under control in the 80s, you compare inflation adjusted wages for production and non-supervisory workers, for kind of workers not managers in 1990, compare that to today, we've seen a 40% increase in inflation adjusted wages, even given the inflation we've had in the last few years. That is a big increase in the purchasing power of typical workers. Similar trends with household income. It is true that there's been a lot of occupation destruction in the middle of the labor market, but the process of creative destruction creates as well as destroys. And there's job growth in lots of occupations that pay middle wage, lots of middle wage occupations. If you look at upward mobility, 3/4 of people who are in their 40s today have a higher income than their parents had when their parents were in their 40s. It's not 100%. We should want it to be 100%. But the idea that America is some sort of a caste system, or some sort of society where nobody goes on to earn more than their parents did is just not true. And so I thought that the public debate around these issues had become so detached from just basic facts. I mean, some of what I've just reported, you can download it from the Department of Labor's website. I felt that the narrative had gotten so detached from the empirical reality that I wanted to try to correct it. I think developments since the pandemic have only strengthened my conviction. I mean, one of the things that I think we learned in the pandemic is just how resilient households are, workers are, businesses are, and the U.S. economy is. If you look at where the economy is now, you wouldn't even know there was a pandemic. Over the course of the past few years, wages have grown faster at the bottom than the top. Wage inequality has declined. Over the course of the past few years, we have seen some real wage increases. I mean, this inflation has been a problem for sure. It's eroded wages and incomes. But that'll be a blip in the longer term trend. We have a huge increase in entrepreneurship. And in people starting businesses that's happened over the past few years. That's one of the ways that the American economy and the American people have responded to this pandemic is by starting a business. What a remarkable thing. What an astonishing testament to our workers, to our workforce, that in the face of the plague, we respond by saying, well, now's the time for me to hang a shingle and start a business and use this as an opportunity. The health of the American dream has only strengthened.
I love the optimism.
The optimism is empirically supported.
Yes, exactly. But too often we hear about everything's down and the doldrums and everything else. And I wonder, doing your research and writing your book and everything else, did you pinpoint maybe what started some of that? I mean, populism has always kind of been underneath a little bit. I know during the Trump years, it definitely escalated quickly. Was that really where you started to see the breaking point happen, or was there something else going on?
Well, I think you're right to point out that this sort of stuff is kind of always out there. And I do think that that's the way an economist would think about it, right? We've had kind of an increase on the margin. And what we don't, I think sometimes we convince ourselves that our political challenges are really a lot larger than they are. We don't need to eradicate the crazy in both parties. We just need to reduce the crazy. I think the roots of populism really start in 2008. There's some really good economics research that studies what happens to advanced economies following financial crises. If you look at 40 or 50 advanced economies and you go back 150 years or so, what you see is that you have a financial crisis, causes a severe recession, causes a big increase in populism. How do you measure populism? Advanced economies have parliaments, and you can look at the share of the seats in parliament that are held by members of a populist party. On average, it takes about 10 years for that sentiment to recede and for the populist share of the legislature to return to where it was prior to the financial crisis. This is not something we see with typical recessions. It's not even something we see with severe recessions that aren't caused by financial crises. It really is driven by financial crises. And, why is that? Imagine a recession that's caused by, some sort of commodity shock, right? Big spike in oil prices, or imagine a recession that's caused by a mistake from the central bank. Those increase unemployment. Those are damaging events, for sure, but they don't reach into the pockets of millions of households in the way that the financial crisis does.
Yeah.
Millions of Americans woke up one day and their homes were worth less than they were before. People feel cheated. So, I don't think it's a surprise that we saw, following the financial crisis, the rise of the Tea Party on the right, the rise of Occupy Wall Street on the left. I don't think it's a surprise that, Bernie Sanders almost beat Hillary Clinton for the nomination in 2016 among Democrats, and then kind of came back again in 2020. I don't think it's a surprise that we saw the rise of a populist candidate, Donald Trump, in 2016. The crisis was severe. I mean, it took until 2014, so 6 years after the financial crisis, for median wages to recover their 2007 level.
Yeah,
6 years where households were worse off than they were in the year 2007. I mean, that's traumatic.
Yeah.
I think we were kind of coming out of this moment in the later years of the Trump presidency. Then of course we had a pandemic. It's been a rough spell. That's where I would date it to, is, kind of 2012, 2013, effect of the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah. That's fascinating too, because I can see all that kind of going together. I hadn't heard about some of those dates in years, as far as 10 years after, and you see the changes, but that all makes a lot of sense, Michael, unfortunately, because it kind of goes back to Rahm Emanuel, right, where he said, "Don't let a crisis go to waste." I'm sure other people said it before he did, but that got popularized during the Obama years. And it reminds me of that, because it's exactly right. That you could go in different directions depending on what that crisis is. It can go into too much government, too little government, too much of a protest movement, or something else. And we see that over time, depending on what the situation is. And so the great financial crisis, the Great Recession is what they like to call it, definitely you saw a turning point in a lot of ways that may not have had the opportunity for someone like Trump to come up in 2015 and 2016, win the election and everything else. And, during the Trump years, and I think you know this, Michael, but I worked there for a year. I was the chief economist for the Office of Management and Budget. So I worked under Russ Vought and others. And so I was there from June 2019 to May of 2020. So right during all the COVID stuff, found myself in a situation room and dealing with all that stuff at that time. And look, I mean, there were some things that I thought were good about the administration, the deregulation. I thought there was a lot of good about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There was a lot of other things that I thought were good, but there was a lot that I didn't think were heading in a good direction either. When you looked at the protectionism and the tariffs that were going on, and when you looked at government spending and how there really wasn't an appetite, I think Russ and others had that appetite, but there wasn't from the top. So it's tough to get that done. Plus Congress passes the budget, but there wasn't really that push to try to get that done. You remember kind of Mnuchin and Nancy Pelosi having those debates or coming to where they find these bigger budgets at the end of the day. But I am concerned that since 2020, after the election and what we've seen in the last couple of years, that now, whether it's the Biden administration or the Trump administration, they're advocating for a lot of the same things. And in fact, your latest Financial Times piece talked about kind of this Trump-Biden connection where there's so much overlap. Whether it be protectionism, where, Biden just continued a lot of that. Trump has talked about a 10%, if not higher, rate of tariffs for everything that's coming in, which is going to hurt Americans. But I think that maybe it gets to what people feel, going back to the American dream is dead, which is not, but some feel that way, that there needs to be a government presence and a politician to say those things and do things so that they'll feel better about themselves. And that worries me because of the populist and larger government situation, where too often what's really the cause of the problem is already too much government. So we're doubling down on government failures and making the situation worse. And so I wonder, Michael, like with your latest piece, I'd love for you to kind of go through some of those points there as we're kind of getting closer to wrapping up. But I think it's so important on what we're hearing about the freedom conservatives, which you and I are kind of members of that, and I was one of the original signatories. I believe you might have been too. And then we have the national conservatives, and they're talking about things on the right. So there's all this debate that's going on. And I wonder when we can actually get back to free market capitalism. Some talk about market fundamentalism out there, and like Orrin Caswa has a recent piece talking about that at Law and Liberty, saying market fundamentalists are the problem. I'm kind of like, well, where have they been in policy for so long? But given all this situation that we're on, I'd love to get your take, Michael, on where you think we're at now, and how do we overcome it, and what's the future going to hold? I know it's a lot in there at once, but I think I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think we're in a bad place. We have a bipartisan consensus right now that tariffs should be used liberally. President Trump put a bunch of tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. President Biden suspended those. He didn't get rid of them.
No.
President Trump put a bunch of tariffs on imports from China. Against a lot of people's expectations, President Biden kept those. President Trump was talking about, as you said, a 10% across the board tariff, 60% tariff on Chinese imports. That would just be a disaster for the U.S. economy. And it's just naked protectionism that would backfire. I mean, it would hurt the manufacturing sector. It would reduce manufacturing employment. But President Trump and his advisors don't agree with that, even though that's the clear finding in the literature. President Biden is also a protectionist. He's pushed for hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies to protect the manufacturing sector, to develop a green technology manufacturing sector, to relocate the production of semiconductors to swing states in the 2024 presidential election. And so, it's bad. President Trump is just horrible on immigration, demonizing immigrants, hanging a sign on the Statue of Liberty that says, you are not welcome here. He didn't literally do that, but that's the effect of what he's doing. President Biden is not nearly as bad as President Trump is on immigration, but President Biden is not good on immigration. Both parties have prioritized fiscal responsibility too low on their list of priorities. But it wasn't that long ago that President Clinton balanced the budget. President Bush kind of blew that up. President Obama, took some steps to reduce the deficit, but didn't really go as far as he should have. But there was at least a concern about fiscal responsibility. It was somewhere on the priority list. Neither President Trump nor President Biden seem to care at all about fiscal responsibility, even though the need to be fiscally responsible is so much larger in 2024, just given the size and trajectory of our debt than it was in the 1990s or during the George W. Bush presidency. We used to have a bipartisan consensus around the value of personal responsibility. And presidents of both parties kind of called Americans to ask more of themselves, to ask more of their communities, to do more, to aspire to more. President, and that's, again, bipartisan. That even kind of predates consensus around economic policy that was, friendly to markets. That goes back decades before President Reagan kind of had that regime change. President Biden, President Trump, each in their own way, to be sure, indulged this narrative of grievance, of victimhood, of class division that really, asks Americans to be smaller and to be smaller than they should be, and to aspire to less. Didn't think I'd, be pining for the days of the Clinton administration, but here we are. And so, when's that going to be better? I mean, the Republican nominating contest is not over yet. There's still, some hope for Governor Haley to be the nominee, who I think would handily win the general election. But a big project for folks who are, disposed to be friendly to markets, disposed to classical liberalism, who believe that the, again, kind of broad consensus that governed the, Reagan administration, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, even the Obama administration, who believed that consensus was correct.
Yeah.
Need to get to work.
Yeah.
And need to convince political leaders, opinion leaders, business leaders of the merits of that approach, and need to build a coalition and need to be ready. We have a very non-dynamic political system, right? Parliamentary democracies throw out the prime minister, multiple parties, parties, grow and shrink in size, coalitions can form, those kinds of democracies, they have a political system that's much more amenable to change and rapid change. We have a presidential system, and so we kind of get to take a swing at change once every 4 years, which is cumbersome. There's work that can be done in between elections. Congress is very important. And so, we need to, I think, do our best to push public policy and to push the country in a direction that, back to the beginning of our conversation, in a direction that advances prosperity, including material prosperity, and that advances human flourishing for as many Americans as possible.
I agree. I've been saying and writing about how I think the largest national crisis is the national debt, and that all goes to excessive government spending as it influences so much of our lives and everything else. And so I think you hit the nail on the head on some of the key issues that need to be discussed, not only this presidential cycle, but afterwards as well. And so I think you're also right that this election is not over. Many people consider it to be, but I don't think it is either. I mean, we need to be able to keep all this stuff in mind as we go through and think about prosperity and economic growth and reducing poverty. I think these things are all going to be so important. Well, I really appreciate you being on the program with the Let People Prosper show, Michael. God bless you and your family, and keep up the great work.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a great conversation, and look forward to talking some more in the future.
Same here, same here. Well, for the audience, please leave us a 5-star rating and go out and review and share it with your friends and family so we can get out this good message to everyone. Until next time, let people prosper.